Thank you so much for joining. I'm super excited you're here. My name is Clint Gibler. I am the head of security research at SemGrep, and I also run the TLDRSec newsletter. And today I'm thrilled to be joined by my good friend, Scott Behrens. So Scott, thanks for being here. Do you mind introducing yourself?
Would love to. Hey, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're calling from. So I'm Scott Behrens. I've been at Netflix for about 11 years as a principal security engineer, working on projects that really span security, privacy, and risk. Super passionate about all things security engineering, really passionate about productivity in the workplace as well, and pour over coffee. So any of those topics are fair game. Looking forward to the discussion today, Clint.
Cool, same. Let's see, so before we get into it, do you mind defining what paved road or perhaps secure default or secure guardrails mean to you? Because it means maybe slightly different things to different people.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I like to think of almost over time, I think my definition of paved roads has changed and evolved. But I think one thing that's consistent when I think about security paved roads is a well-supported product, feature, or technology that helps others manage or eliminates security risks. And I use the term well-supported because I want to be very clear, the technologies have to work well or they won't be used. I think that's probably the shortest, succinct definition I could possibly give, is a well-supported technology that eliminate or manage security risks away for users.
Cool. Yeah, I like that definition a lot. And I think if I recall correctly, you had a AppSec Cali talk a few years ago where one of the things you presented was like for the services that had certain sort of paved road security controls, you had actually stats that were like it moved criticals down to highs and highs down to mediums, like at scale.
Yeah, great question. So, or great observation. I think one of the things that we're often thinking about when I say managing or driving down security risks is we want to get to a position where our security exposure is very rarely critical. I think that's an ideal state for us. And so we have the right, infrastructure decisions, like our applications or assets have very low blast radius, they're isolated and segmented, and our controls are so robust that we rarely have to worry about specific attacks and techniques. And now that's an ideal state. And to be very clear, while I might have talked about that a few years ago, we're still much on our journey there at Netflix, and I imagine most companies are as well. But I think one of the things that I'm often thinking about when driving paved road adoption and really thinking about what that can mean from a leverage perspective, I'm often thinking about not only how much security risk can we manage away from our engineers, but just how much innovation velocity that unlocks for them. I think one of the things that we often forget about is if our engineers are burdened with always implementing security features and functionality for scratch, that's all the time they're taking away from doing the work they really love to do, which in a lot of respects isn't security. Maybe it's developing distributed systems or working on a specific cache service. We want to keep the engineers focused on the things that bring them passion, and let us provide those paved roads to kind of give them that time back, which is one of the benefits of having paved roads is if you do them right, they unlock innovation and they eliminate or manage security risks.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, we're going to get into the details of that in a second. So thank you everyone who answered the poll so far. I think let's chat first about some of the landmines to watch out for if you're building a paved road. And then after that, some like how do you validate the security control guarantees? So how do you make sure you're like, I think this is true, but how is it actually true? And then we'll get into questions. So feel free to be posting questions there at the bottom. But yeah, let's get into it.
Yeah, I love this question. Gotchas for the paved road. And I think, by the way, I'll list out a bunch of gotchas and some potential solutions. Would definitely love to hear from the audience, maybe in the chat, like what are some of the gotchas you've had if you've worked with paved roads, and share some of your experiences with others. I'm sure we'll all learn, including myself. So when I think about what are the landmines to watch out for, I think one of the first ones is really, do I have buy-in and commitment from the company? Are they really serious about paved roads? Are they open to us maybe starting to create some of these platforms and services and having engineers use them? It's going to be really hard if we live in a culture or an engineering organization that has 20 desperate runtimes or languages that they operate at scale. it's going to be really hard to pave because there's a lack of homogeneity between the environment. Things are so different from each other that's going to be a challenge. And so we have to first ask ourselves, is the company actually ready? And if you're in that position now, let's say that's a challenge that you are facing at your organization, it's really about coming in with a combined message, as I mentioned earlier, around, hey, not only does this help the security organization to get these types of platforms and paved roads in place, but we can also do that to unlock unrelated to security other use cases, such as maybe higher resiliency in systems or higher reliability. A lot of the teams that are building these types of platforms actually are building them for non-security use cases. And when we combine the two together, we unlock security and potentially other benefits. And so to give a concrete example, imagine like an RPC framework or an API service gateway like Envoy, which is used for service mesh for RPC traffic between services. There's a lot of benefits to having a service mesh in your environment unrelated to security. But if we can put security into that service mesh, let's think about maybe access control, web application firewall, or something like coarse-grained authorization. We've now just unlocked a more secure RPC infrastructure while also getting a bunch of the benefits that Envoy provides around routing and resiliency and all those types of things. And so I just want to sort of mention that when we go and have this conversation with the company about buy-in and commitment, it's really beneficial to bring in as part of that story the broader leverage that we get with these types of platforms. I'll walk through one more challenge that sometimes I see is really like determining where to pave and where to allow off-roading. This is kind of a little bit of a different flavor of the first thing I mentioned, but in reality, when you're just starting off, maybe you're a smaller company or your company's just kind of hitting that growth phase or what have you, there's going to be use cases that you're going to have to let off-road, and you're only going to be able to pave real specific pieces. And I think when we think through about whereing to allow the off-roading, this is where, from a solution perspective, you really want to understand the risks and the threats in your environment. Because it might just be that there's certain use cases that just don't provide a lot of risk to the organization today, and you should just let them kind of simmer. That's really hard for security practitioners. We absolutely want to address risk, but we have to be thoughtful when we're in the early stages of our build out of a security program. And so I just encourage our listeners when they're thinking about what to pave to first really kind of understand where are those risks in my environment? What are those assets I care to protect, my crown jewels? And what are the technologies used by those assets? And is there one thing I can just absolutely nail? Because what we don't want to do is we don't want to pick a particular control that's really difficult, that causes a lot of developer friction, and we lose that sense of trust. So maybe we start off with something like a really awesome SSO solution, single sign-on, and it's got great ergonomics and it unlocks a lot of value for the organization. Or maybe we pick something even simpler, like we want to make sure all of our applications have good ownership information and can rebake and redeploy if there's an incident. So that way we can mitigate if there's like a breach or something like a log4j. And I think it's just really thoughtful as you're thinking through what to pave, choosing something that matters to the business, choosing something you can be successful at, and then just being explicit about where you're going to allow that off-roading and kind of understanding where those risks are that you're leaning into so that you can address them at the right time.
Nice. Yeah, I like that. To dive a little bit deeper into one of the things you mentioned about, it may not be a good current situation if your environment is very heterogeneous. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about like in what dimensions you mean heterogeneous, and then also like how do you, the step one for that is like understanding your environment. So I think like how could maybe one person in not a lot of time, at least in like a hacky way, I have some ideas, but yeah, curious to hear what you think. So dimensions of heterogeneity, it's kind of like, okay, how hard is this battle going to be? And then also like, how do you even get the data to make the call in the first place?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think a lot of it, the tactics I'll recommend will change depending on the size of the company. If you're in a startup with 50, 60 engineers, I would say go have some conversations. You realistically can probably talk to people. I think as engineers, we have this tendency to want to build the automation, the solution, the at scale version. But in reality, sometimes the best option is just to go manually talk to folks. And when I'm referring to homogeneity, I'm really referring to what makes all of our applications different from a technology perspective. We'll scope this to AppSec for the discussion and leave kind of infra to the side. So I might be thinking about things like runtimes. I might be thinking about things like RPC. I might be thinking about things like such as gateway and data access, and also infrastructure, things like load balancers. I might be kind of considering everything around the outside of the business logic of a given application. So if I was to say high RPS APIs, and we were to kind of imagine what we'd want to see there, how different is every high RPS API at your organization? Is one written in Rust with like, I don't know, some open source gateway and it talks directly to a cockroach database? Is there another API that's written in Java that talks to an Aurora database that uses all, like how much variety of technologies do we see across the stack? And that's really what I'm referring to when I mention homogeneity. So when we're thinking about like, how do we get that information? I think I walk through one tactic, I'll walk through a few more. So if you're a smaller organization, go talk to people. Other options you have are leveraging a combination of dynamic scanning, static analysis, asset inventory, open source solutions. If you have the ability to query all your assets and infrastructure, maybe you're in a cloud, you can start to build some of the tooling and automation to do that. Some of the technologies we've done in the past at Netflix is we've looked at source code to determine what applications frameworks are used. We do things like scanning for the usage of particular libraries and services. And we do that both in code, and we also do dynamic scanning where we have to do sort of like at runtime checks. And I think the automations that we've put in place have paid a lot of dividends, but I do want to mention that it's even with open source solutions, there is there's a cost and a barrier to entry to doing that. And so I would recommend that the closer you get to an at-scale environment, the more you want to invest in those automations early, because you're just not going to be able to scale with manual conversations. The smaller your environment, I would say just go talk to people to start before you build your inventory. Clint, what are your thoughts? How would you tackle the collecting more information? I'm curious.
Yeah, I like everything you've described. Another thing, just to share something different, is if you like when I think about deploying sort of security controls and like thinking about the homogeneity or not of the environment, like another example would be like, where is code hosted? Like, is everything on github.com in one org, or do you have Bitbucket and like GitHub Enterprise and github.com and like 7 others? For CI/CD, for example, is like everyone using GitHub Actions, or are some people using like Azure DevOps? Some people are using Jenkins. Some people are using Circle CI. So I think code hosting, like, is it all in one place? I was chatting with a friend recently who's at a company that's been around a while and has had acquisitions. And yeah, he was like, there's source code is in like 10 places, depending on like how the, like, was it an acquisition or not and things like that. So I think tactically for getting that information, like, let's say you have an org on GitHub that has a bunch of repos. I feel like in 100 or 200 lines of Python, you could probably write something that basically queries, like, what are all the different repos we have? What is the language breakdown? Either getting that from the API or just running Tokay or clock or slot count or some command line tool. Picking out like which, so that'll be like what languages are being used. You could also probably figure out like what frameworks are being used in terms of like what front end frameworks, what middleware, what web frameworks are being used. Either picking that out with like ripgrep or grep or like semgrep, something like super easy and lightweight that's just like, hey, here's like popular frameworks, like what are we using where? Because I think like it doesn't have to be like a live dashboard, but I guess one output that I think would be useful is basically like what languages are we using and how much in repos that are still having active development, and like what web frameworks or front end frameworks are we using and like where. And you could also pick out information like, are we using different clouds or which services of different clouds? I feel like that's interesting. Like if 90% of your environment is like AWS, but you see like this one random repo using GCP, and as a security team, you're like, I didn't even know we used GCP. So like, that's interesting. But anyway, yeah, TLDR, I think code hosting, CI/CD, and then like programmatically querying code hosting platforms to figure out like languages and frameworks used. To me, that seems probably tractable to write and do in like a day, but is like meaningful information. But yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, it's a great point. And I love that idea of like just getting kind of plugging into, if you do have consistent build CI, like plugging into those areas to get some of that information and starting with code, which makes a lot of sense. And I think depending on your environment, it might be easier to go with Clint's route to integrate right with the build CI if that's, you know, kind of in a single, maybe there's a single organization on GitHub that has the majority, or maybe you work in a mono repo, you're fortunate to be in that position. If so, you have like one central location, and some other environments where there's less of that homogeneity. I think we have to look at other tactics, like maybe even including dynamic scanning and stuff. And so I think there's probably a mixture of controls that we would leverage, but I love the idea of starting with code. So one of the things that struck me as you were talking, Clint, is I was thinking about how, like, when we actually know that information, it also helps us have these conversations with maybe central and platform teams. You know, it gives us more leverage to say, hey, maybe we want to go all in on Java, and just like, we want to do more than just security. Like, we just want to, like, maybe we can get more folks to adopt Java, or maybe it's some flavor of Java that we want to focus on. And so I think there's that, not only is this useful for targeting where we focus our security paved roads, but it's maybe we have broader conversations around increasing homogeneity across the environment, which is also exciting. So yeah,
actually, along those lines, James had an excellent question in the chat. He says, standardization enables automation. How do you obtain buy-ins for standardization of tool stacks?
That's a tough question. Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that's one of the things that there's a philosophy. I mean, I've heard it at Netflix, and I'm sure some of you've heard it at your organizations. Well, you know, if we have to build on the paved road, if we have to have standardization, we're going to move slower. There's this sort of belief that the less standard things are, that it gets to play into my special expertise, or I can kind of choose anything I want. And so because the world is my oyster, I'm going to be able to move faster. And I think what that type of thinking fails to think about is the overall life cycle of the product or the thing that you're building. So maybe in the short term, you actually do get like a production release faster, but you're introducing potentially several dimensions of security debt. Maybe it's knowledge debt, because nobody knows how to operate the thing that you built so far away from everything else. Maybe it's architecture debt. You're moving so fast that you didn't consider the long-term architecture sustainability of your technology choices. I think one of the things that I often have a conversation with when I'm trying to get folks onto standardized approaches, I'm like, standardization helps us optimize long-term potential. And so if your company is in it for the long game, and you'll see it in your culture memo, it'll say something like, we're here for long-term, whatever. Once you see that, that's what you anchor on. And you mentioned that if we get to a more standardized model, while that maybe in the beginning, it's a little bit harder for us to adopt it. Folks have to learn some things. They have to adjust how they do build CI. They have to adjust how they work in their IDE or how they test and run code. But in the long term, because we're more standardized, we can bring in more engineers that understand what we're working on, because we're using very similar stuff, and they can rotate across teams and be really ecstatic to like transfer and get a new job and like be able to contribute code to these repos. There's all these benefits that start to happen. And I try to package that up in that, like, this is really about building a long-term sustainable engineering culture. And I've had the best luck positioning it with senior leadership in that language, because they're often thinking on a strategic time horizon, 2 to 5 years. And so that would be some of the framing and the language that I would suggest you try out, James.
Yeah, and I like how you're emphasizing not just the security benefits, but to senior leaders and engineering leaders. You're like, hey, this is about building software that's easier to maintain, and we're going to be able to ship more and better stuff faster. So it's really a business argument as much as it is a security argument.
I find that we get the most leverage when we position security as an enabler and part of the overall business objectives. I think for a while in the industry, it's all this stuff and security. It's always like security is this extra piece. It's kind of to the side. When we come in and we lead with security and risk, we start using tooling, technology, frameworks, language that our stakeholders don't understand. And so when I have a lot of these conversations, I'm talking about innovation velocity. I'm talking about like having developers get to work on what they want, like making sure security is managed outside so that they have cycles to deliver more features, have a healthier development pipeline. I'm very rarely actually talking specifically about security. Instead, I'm really talking about an environment that if it's secure, what changes for the business. For some stakeholders, maybe they care that it mitigates a risk, or it mitigates an O-Day, or it mitigates some risk around their crown jewels, but a lot of folks won't have the same passion that we do.
So yeah, a quick maybe like furthering question in that domain. So I feel like if let's say your company already has a platform engineering team or some team who's responsible for improving internal DevX or developer productivity. So if you're in a company that has that, then I think something I've heard you and Asta and Patrick and others recommend is like, yeah, partner with that team because they're already doing some amount of standardization. But I guess I'm curious about your thoughts. Like, what if you're in a company that maybe doesn't have a team like that? Like maybe it's smaller earlier on. Yeah, curious if you have any thoughts for if there's not existing standardization efforts. Like you did talk about speaking to the business value, but I'm curious if there's like any sort of feet on the ground or like tactical things you would think about just to make it like as actionable as possible.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, I think if there's not a lot of standardization, often what I'm going to be thinking about is like, is there anything that's standard? Do we deploy all in the same cloud? Does everybody use a load balancer? Like, can we get everybody on a load balancer? That seems pretty low friction. What can we put in the load balancer? Can we put it in web application firewall? Can we make sure our SSO solution integrates easily into the load balancer, that we have great? So for me, I think even if there's a lack of standardization in things like runtime, what piece is there consistency in? And the answer might be you need to step outside of the application and look at your infrastructure or how applications access data. So, don't kind of pin yourself and say, oh my gosh, we have 20 different runtimes. We'll step a layer out. Is everybody using a similar RPC framework? Is everybody using libraries? Okay, no, they're not. Let's step another layer out. Does everybody use the same network ingress and egress? Are they all in the same cloud? And then I just start to think about like where there is consistency to place those controls. Let's say that doesn't go well either. The next thing I'm really going to be thinking about is like, well, where are the crown jewels? And for your organization, how you get and understand that information might be a little different. Maybe you're a public company and like, you read the 10K, you deeply understand the business, so you can kind of understand what risks matter. You kind of associate some of that stuff and you're like, all right, these are probably the crown jewels that I need to protect as a security professional. And then you go and identify where those crown jewels are. And here it's maybe a little bit less about paving the road and it's more about paving that asset. So instead of us creating like a reusable road, we just make sure that this particular asset is a castle with a great road that kind of, goes all through the castle that folks can drive on. The challenge with that approach is it's not as scalable, but it might just be where you're at as an organization. I think that there's, when I was early in the Netflix era, we spent a ton of our time working on securing our crown jewels. It was a huge focus for the organization. It continues to be, but early, that's where we spent our time. We did not have the leverage to go, and there wasn't a platform team. There was no platform organization when I started at the company. And so, how I would recommend kind of in summary is, keep stepping a layer up and saying like, can I actually implement a particular paved road technology in something that is shared? Like considering things like infrastructure, data access, things like load balancers, things like your build CI. If everybody's on the same build CI but uses different runtimes, you still might have leverage opportunities. Then the next piece is, well, if I don't, let's go back and look at those assets. Let's go find where the crown jewels are. That might be a mixture of manual or automated discovery efforts. If you're fortunate to have PCI, you probably know where your data is if it's PCI compliant. If you have other types of data that you need to protect or other risks, you might have to do a little bit more fact finding. And then it's about paving those assets, specifically determining what are the risks that really, if that asset is compromised, how do you think that's going to happen? And then placing controls across those assets. And that might not scale as well, but it might be the best approach where you're at if you don't have a platform team and there's a lack of homogeneity across your environment.
Nice. Yeah, I really like, just to like double click on one of the things you said that I think is like a very clever insight. So like, let's say a huge percentage of your org is like, we use Java and Spring. You're like, okay, cool. We can put in some things there. Or you're like, okay, we have a very diverse set of say languages and frameworks. You're like, but like every service has like an Envoy or some other sidecar. And you're like, okay, cool. Maybe we put it in the sidecar. Or you're like, well, everyone uses the same CI/CD platform. Okay, cool. Maybe we put some checks there. Or, okay, maybe we don't even do that, but everything's deployed with Terraform. Okay, what sort of like paved road security defaults can we put in Terraform? Or, okay, maybe we don't even do that. Okay, maybe, well, we all use like AWS. Okay, what are like like at that. So it's almost like depending on where the similarity is, you sort of like start like precise, and then you're like, okay, well, what is sort of expanding out, like what is shared. So you already said this. I just wanted to like emphasize, because I thought, to me, it's such like a clever, good idea.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think it's a nice model to apply. And if you find yourself getting to the end and you don't see a lot of those similarities, step back in and really think about where those crown jewels are, and work kind of asset out. Make sure to get your crown jewels secure, and that's an okay place to be. Not everyone's going to have access to platforms, and so I just want to acknowledge that as well.
For sure. Yeah, and actually, along these lines, Nathaniel, thanks for joining. My friend had a related question. He says, since paved roads are often implemented into existing frameworks or libraries that your engineers are using, do you find the working model for a team tasked with implementing paved roads is collaborating with platform teams that own these systems on driving the security-driven changes, or are obvious surfaces this team would own in isolation? So I guess maybe, do you have like a separate security paved road team, or are you like trying to get platform team to implement the security things, or maybe some sort of organizational team structure type?
Yeah, we do a little bit of both. We have a security service engineering organization at Netflix that builds a lot of our identity and access services, our cryptography services, number of platforms. We also have a security platforms team that builds a number of our like visibility and detection platforms, things like vulnerability scanning, third-party dependency stuff, secret protection. That's also on our cryptography team. And we build these products, and they're self-serviceable. You can pull them into your application. You can work and often run them. They're often libraries or APIs. And that strategy kind of works, but developers generally don't even want to have to pull stuff in. So another part of our strategy is that strategic partnership with the platform organizations at Netflix. And so we often focus and say, hey, where is that Spring Boot library, or where is that shared RPC sidecar? And we implement our controls into those frameworks. That's often done as a strategic partnership. And, we try to build great products that people want so that the platform teams want to integrate them into their code bases. And that approach overall has worked well. We have to be careful stacking bets. If you stack so much onto a specific platform and everybody's kind of working on it, you might never get the platform done. And so we're cautious to really put our security controls where they matter the most. But it's definitely a little bit of a split. Like, we build the security products, but we have a platform team that we often work with from an integration perspective. And that overall approach has worked well.
Yeah, I like it. So Casey asked a question that I really like. What are some of the most effective paved road solutions you've built?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'll share my favorite. It's a service called Squash. Squash is an access right-sizing management utility that takes a look at access patterns across various interfaces. We'll kind of keep it generic. And after looking at a period of time, it determines what the right access policy should be based on usage patterns. I love this solution for so many reasons. Configuring access control is really hard, whether it's SSH or a control plane that you use for build CI. Who should have access to your repository is challenging. How we think about those things. What I love about this solution is it really takes let's actually look at the patterns, who is using these assets, and then let's just actually set the policy for who's actually using it. And this is like anybody who works in identity governance will say birthright access. We want people to have just what they need access to do their jobs. And often if we actually look at the access patterns and that's how we size our access policies, developers don't know anything has changed, but we've reduced a ton of risk. So imagine a world where you don't know who's using your system, so you open it up to everyone. Instead, what we do is we look and okay, it's opened up. Who's using it? Oh, it looks like these folks. Okay, let's create an access policy that's right sized for those use cases. I think that's one of the most exciting projects because it has so little. Developers don't have to think about it, worry about it, but they just know that their administrative interfaces have effectively a least privilege access model. Another thing that I like, I would say maybe a second favorite paved road control. and less of a control, but it is our asset inventory system that provides the visibility part of our visibility, protect, detect, respond, recover, let's say NIST CSF lifecycle. I love our asset inventory system because it's a collection of other inventories across Netflix, and it gives us the ability to slice dimensions on pretty much any particular technology stack, owner, risk, threat, incident, previous security issue, callers that are calling in, what applications call this, what applications that this application calls, what database it uses, who calls the database. We kind of understand almost everything about the application's runtime and build information, risks, and threats. And because of that, when we walk into a meeting to talk to teams about Paved Road stuff, we're so much more informed. They're sometimes surprised when we walk in a room and, you know that about this? You know that I build this way, or I have, these particular qualities. And so I think that, my two favorite would be our ability to right size access and our inventory system right now are two of my favorite controls.
Yeah, I think what you build from an asset inventory point of view is super cool. I'm curious, you mentioned like we know these apps talk to these databases and maybe these services talk to these other services. Could you tell a little bit more about like how you know that information?
Sure. Yeah. So great question. So we at Netflix turned on E&I enhanced monitoring, which is a feature built into AWS. And we use TCP flow logs, which is sort of how TCP information flows across Netflix. And so there's a service networking team that kind of provides that tooling and technology. And we pull that in to effectively look, with the enhanced networking information, combined with our application build CI asset inventory system, we can say, hey, we see traffic coming from this application going to this other application, both ingress and egress. On the user side, it's a little different. Let's step up a layer and say, outside of TCP flow, let's talk about like layer 7. So when we see a user authenticate to a particular service or an application authenticate to a particular service, we have two different systems that do that. We keep records of those events. They're stored in a data warehouse table. And so we kind of understand what users are calling what applications are calling what applications. We know the users because they're logging in with SSO. We know the applications because they're using a strong cryptographic mechanism of authenticating and authorizing to those services. When we combine both of those things in our data warehouse, we now have the ability to slice and say, for a given application, who are my users? Who are the applications talking to me? We can do that, as I mentioned, knowing the actual flow of the data as well as the authentication for both users and applications.
Nice, cool. Yeah, that makes sense that you would have sort of runtime information to inform those things. I wasn't sure if you were potentially informing it statically in terms of like, we see like this client library being used, so it probably means you're talking to this service, or we see you're using like a Postgres ORM and we see the connection string is like whatever. Yeah, the dynamic makes sense.
It's definitely dynamic. We've had ideas about static, and so if folks are interested, please geek out with me sometime on that. We imagine that if our entire infrastructure was more declarative, wouldn't it be great just to define who should talk to you and just have it like in a config file that's checked in the source code? I would love to live in that world. So I think that there could be a future, Clint, with the right architecture that you could do all this in code and kind of know the state of your ecosystem. But we're not there, and I think that that's a long ways away. So.
Yeah, I'm going to, I might be misremembering this, but somewhere in the annals of TLDRSec history, I feel like Max Burkhardt, maybe at Airbnb, talked about some blog post where basically they did have some sort of static config files that like allowed who to talk to who, or like which service was talking to which service that they could then do some sort of like programmatic linting on or something like that. I'll try to find it. I don't know. I could be misremembering. I read too much, but another asset inventory thought, just spitballing here. So let's say if you know which, say web frameworks different repos are using, and you're like, hey, we see that this repo is Flask, and we wrote a company internal, say, middleware or a helper thing that like adds default security headers or does mutual TLS or like whatever it is. Like we see you're using this thing that could be part of the paved road, but we don't see that you're using the security control we built. You could imagine having like a dashboard or a self-service portal where you have a place where you're just like continuously providing like easy, simple guidance to be like, hey, you are close to the paved road. Did you know that this thing existed that like would significantly reduce your potential risk? And like, you just maybe import this module or something.
Yeah, yeah, we should talk a little bit about the difference between secure defaults and self-service. And realistically, I would encourage having a strategy that considers both, because not everything you're going to be able to secure by default. Honestly, secure by default kind of expensive. You might have to do integration, testing, all those types of things. Where secure default, if you get a really well-packaged library with good documentation, with self-service, you can have your users then go and self-service that particular use case. And so I think you need to have a mixture of both. When I think about, reaching the user who's kind of on the paved road, but maybe not there from a security perspective, that's where you really want to have your guidance and have really clear and explicit guidance to users. Again, mentioning asset inventory, we kind of understand the particular asset, what technologies you're using, and then what controls would be relevant, which ones they don't have. And if they come to our self-service tooling, we kind of tell them, hey, you're 70% of the way there. There's this library that you need to pull, or this configuration that you should set. And, kind of like getting the user to green, so they kind of understand what they need to do. Being able to provide that guidance in a consolidated way that's consistent is really beneficial for engineers. They don't want to talk to like 3 or 4 different security people and get 3 or 4 different pieces of advice. But we can kind of say, hey, this is what we see, and here's what we provide you, and it's a consistent message that's useful. And so I definitely think that having the guidelines, having the tips for folks on how far along they are in their journey of becoming secure, and where to get that information is really helpful. And it's definitely something that we do at Netflix.
Nice. Yeah, I think the Chime folks have released a few blog posts about sort of like a security scorecard. It's like, hey, your services are currently yellow or like C or something, and here's the 3 things you could do to make it an A. And then it's sort of a little bit gamified, and people want to compete a bit. No eng leader wants their team to be like in yellow versus like the other teams that are green, or things like that. So moving on to another question from Wu, who says let's see, how to design a system that will static scan a code base and warn or block the pull request, specifically around balancing business needs, like feature to market, productivity, less friction, as well as security, especially if it involves interpersonal reviews, approval, and negotiation between the security and dev teams. So I can offer some quick thoughts, because I spend a fair amount of time thinking about this. So I think it depends on your company and the risk tolerance. So if you are a small startup moving quickly, then to be honest, probably security is not the core thing. It's like actually finding product market fit and building a user base and like making money. So if security is slowing things down too much, it might not be optimal from a business point of view. Conversely, if you are like a fintech company or some highly regulated company, like you probably, like security issues could be very costly from a regulatory or a compliance point of view. So I think depending on the business, this might change a little bit, how much you balance like dev productivity versus security. But one thing I found that is generally useful is for the various static analysis tool, you can, like before integrating in the CI/CD, you can just like scan everything you have and just be like, okay, what do the results look like? Like, are you getting 1 million findings? Is it like 10? Sort of what does it look like? And you might also find that certain specific rules or vulnerability classes are either higher or lower signal, and this could vary by language and framework for your company. So I think I would maybe do some offline scanning and then like manually triage a bunch of the like critical or high severity findings, and then say, okay, anecdotally, do we feel like this is like very high signal or not? Because in practice, like probably you want results to be like, I don't know, 75, 90% true positive if you're like blocking pull request. I think it's generally like, there is sort of a staged workflow you could do where at first you're like scanning offline and you're just triaging results. Then maybe you are scanning kind of at PR time, but maybe you're just sending results to the security team and not even showing to developers, just to get a feel for like how much volume is there here? Like, are we showing each developer 20 issues every day, or is it like a tractable amount? And then maybe, so running it in the background, and then maybe gradually you're like commenting on PRs, but not blocking them. And then eventually maybe blocking in like a very small set of cases that you're like 99% sure, like if this check fires, it's like probably right, and it's super high criticality. So I don't know, that's a lot of detail, but I think I would just do like a gradual rollout with lots of like human in the middle triaging in between to make sure that the experience for developers is going to be as good as possible. But yeah, Scott, what do you think?
Yeah, I was just kind of jotting on a summary. I like that, like, tiering where you disrupt and starting slow. You receive all the noise, eventually you tune it, and you kind of eventually get to a place where you're in a blocking mode. Might make sense at the organization, especially if you've nailed the signal. I would say I would shoot for much higher than 90% false positive personally, especially if we're working at scale with thousands of pull requests potentially a day. I would also say starting small. You don't need to eliminate all vulnerability classes. You also don't need to eliminate the most egregious vulnerability class. And that might come as a surprise, but like pick one that you can nail. Like show that you can get a vulnerability class out of the ecosystem with minimal disruption to end users. And so, find a particular class of issues or control you want to see adopted, depending on how you're doing it, and just nail that. And then rinse, repeat. And you can then have a motto like, hey, we're a security organization that like finds a class of issues and we just eliminate them. We just rinse and repeat that over and over again. In my experience, when we've gone very broad with static or dynamic scanning strategies, it just we weren't successful. We were just kind of like, we went so broad with the number of findings and like the triage processes that it just made it really challenging. And so I find that the strategy that have worked the best in my experience has been to start small. Pick a couple things to just nail and then rinse, repeat the methodology once you get it working.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think there's like part of it is what is like the ongoing operational time that it's going to require either developers or the security team. So to Scott's point, like let's say I don't know, let's say you're like command injection or like RCE or something serious. Let's say that like you triage a bunch of those and you find that the tool or rule or whatever is like, I don't know, like only 20% true positives. So it's like mostly noise. Now compare that to, I don't know, like not setting the right cookie flags, but you're like 100% accurate for that. It's like, obviously the like remote code execution is like a lot more serious than like not setting cookie flags. But in terms of like the operational time for your security team to triage versus, like, hey, this is always right. This is maybe not the greatest example because like you probably do care about RCE, but basically the point to Scott's point, it's like, it also depends what is like the ongoing operational time required by your team to do it. So if there are like small wins that are maybe not optimally, maximally reducing risk, but are going to require like minimal ongoing time and is like a very trivial way, like maybe you even have like an auto fix. So developers, like every time it fires, it's 100% right. It's never wrong. And also there's like an auto fix button. So developers can just click, like it takes them 0 time. It takes you 0 time. And your security posture is a little bit better, even if it's not like the biggest risk. So I think that that's a good point. Let's see. So I think I'm going to keep going through the questions. So thank you everyone for putting so many great questions. But unfortunately, we do have a hard cutoff at the hour. So Scott, while I'm reading more of the questions, do you want to talk a little bit about like measuring the security control effectiveness? Like how do we know these are actually working?
Yeah.
So at scale in practice? Because I think that that's often overlooked. And you shared a bunch of like nuance there that I thought was interesting.
Yeah. How do you know that it's working? I think it's a great question. I think one thing that it definitely encourages like when you start to combine paved roads and you start to think about things like business logic and other things, it's really valuable to do more than just pen testing your environment and to really take it from a more of a broader red team sort of perspective. It might be that you think you've done a good job paving your front door, but you didn't realize that your assets talk to a specific AWS technology that has world writable access from everybody at your company, as an example. And so there's value in bringing in that sort of like adversarial perspective to really say, hey, us as defenders, we're sort of defining a paved road, but is that how attackers look at our environment? Do they look at it with the same lens that we do? A lot of organizations define their controls based on team charters and organizational structures. Our attackers don't think in lists, they think in graphs. If we're not defending in graphs, then we're in a dangerous position, which is why I'm a huge advocate of red teaming adversarial work. It allows us to sort of challenge those types of assumptions. And I think another piece that I would encourage folks as part of your inventory system design is like measure the controls. You might not have complete confidence that they're operating correctly, but do you know where they're adopted? Can you scan for that? Can you scan for that in code? Do you need to check it dynamically? And then like, what are the things that we could scan for to give us more confidence that the thing is working the way we expect? Maybe it's we fire a signal at it and we expect an alert to go off. And the one day that alert doesn't go off, we spin up an incident. You know, maybe it's, you know, we check the efficiency of our access policies. We say, we see that there's 100 people on the policy, but over nine months, only 3 people used it. It's not a very efficient policy. Maybe we should have a way to fix those types of things. So I think as part of the design of your inventory systems, you know, try to work to get your security products to ideally report themselves, how they're working, where they're installed, what kind of guarantees. And you can use that and to validate that, that's a combination of like having controls report where they're at, thinking about things like test-driven development. So, you know, how do I guarantee the security correctness of my controls? Could be something that could be part of your testing framework. And maybe that's tests at runtime that the developers run. Maybe that's tests that you run as part of your scanning of the environment. And to be cautious of overcorrecting too. Don't want to be in a position where you have so much validation of your controls that you spend most of your time validating everything. There's a balance to strike there. And realistically, I would say, depending on how important that control is for your organization, would be proportional to the level of investment on assurance.
Yeah, that makes sense. Along those lines, like a hypothetical, before I get into that, I don't know, I feel like I keep citing related work, but around the importance of validating security controls, Phil Venables, who's currently the CISO of Google Cloud, and I think former CISO of like Goldman Sachs or something. He has a really excellent blog at philvenables.com. But one of his blog posts, I remember he was talking specifically about the importance of validating security controls, where I think in a past life, the company had suffered a breach or some attack that in theory was perfectly mitigated by existing either products or security controls they had built. And they were like, well, like, how is this attack possible? We had, you know, this thing. And they were like, well, actually, like that tool or whatever had been reporting, you know, error states or something like 3 months ago. And the alerts got annoying. So someone like turned off the alerts or like stopped looking at it. And it was basically like, it hadn't been working for a while, but they didn't have anything testing it. So yeah, another example I think you shared, like a hypothetical, like, let's say you've invested a lot in build provenance so that, you know, like the thing the developer writes goes to CI and then is deployed. Like, let's say that whole thing is super locked down. You sign everything. You're like, everything is like salsa 3 and you're like, I don't know, chef's kiss. But then the, maybe like the binary that's built is like stored to an S3 bucket that like is like world read writable. So even though like all of the infrastructure, like you did everything perfectly, but there's some like random implementation detail that like, well, actually anyone could like overwrite this thing that we securely built if like they happen to discover it somehow. So I think that's a kind of thing that like without red teaming, I feel like would be hard to find.
Yeah, it's a great point. And like maybe to give like another concrete example, it's almost like, yeah, our salsa framework, we're a V3, things look good, but then like you realize like, but maybe the compute platform where your build CI runs has an injection vuln. Like if you start to really unpack like the actual SDLC, I think we're often thinking about the artifacts and the developer that's like shipping it, but like there's an unbelievable web of systems and infrastructure that is involved. And as an attacker, I'm just thinking about every piece of that, and which might include an S3 bucket as an example. So I think it's a great point, Clint.
Yeah, just yeah, it's like there's all these different parts in the chain, and like all of them could be bulletproof except for like one that you never thought of. So maybe just a quick question. Roland asked about Squash. Is this totally internal or open source, or is there maybe a talk or a blog post where one could learn more about it?
Yeah, let me. I'll go back and do a little bit of work. We don't have Squash open sourced. It's really heavily integrated into our custom identity and access solutions that we built at Netflix. But I think the methodology is really what's unique about it. Effectively does like a knapsack sorting algorithm, which you can great references on Wikipedia and probably at this point GPT for how to do that. But that's kind of effectively the design. The algorithm was effectively lifted and shifted into this product from a blog post, and then we just started to work to roll it out. I don't want to underestimate that the level of effort for a tool like this is quite high, but definitely we didn't. There was no prior innovation. We effectively we pulled an off-the-shelf algorithm to do this kind of sorting, and overall it's worked pretty well.
Yeah, and also shout out to Letty Lorenko, who is a designer on the Netflix AppSec team, who I did a podcast with a bit ago, maybe 1 or 2 months ago, who also talked about sort of auto right-sizing Google Drive permissions and maybe SSH permissions as well. I forget, but yeah, she listen to that if you want to hear like a really cool, like thinking about building and rolling out Paved Road or sort of security defaults from kind of like a user experience point of view. Yeah, she was very thoughtful about like, how do we make this very clear to people, and how do we make it transparent to them, and how do we minimize friction? So yeah, I thought her discussion was, I learned a lot from it. So I encourage you to check that out as well. Okay, so let's see, a question from Anonymous Kokere. Let's see, curious about the methodology from the inception to adoption for a certain paved path idea. So in general, it's not always only beneficial to present a great idea, but there are several elements that lead up to the adoption, such as presenting the supporting data, marketing, socializing, partnerships from like-minded advocates, etc. How have you been successful in your role deploying these scalable paved roads, and what's your methodology and sort of your approach?
Such a great question. I feel like we could spend a whole podcast on that question itself. But I love that you mentioned sort of the marketing and the socializing piece. You really want to get folks excited to use it. And in any modern company, we're going to have planning, we're going to have staffing, we're going to have resourcing. All those things are going to come into play. And when teams are thinking about what they want to work on this year, how much of them are really excited to work on security? So we really have to think about our branding and our positioning. I think when getting a new idea together, some of the tactics that we've had luck at Netflix is kind of starting small with our experiments. Finding a team that we've had successful partnerships with in the past and saying, hey, we're building this new SSO function, or we're building this new way to manage long-term secrets. Like, we want to partner with you and see how, and see if you'd be helpful to give us early input and feedback. And so we definitely leverage early partnerships to inform also where to go partner and what to work on. We do try to leverage things. We run like a developer satisfaction survey and a sentiment survey every year. It gives us a lot of insights into the types of pains and challenges developers are seeing. We go talk to developers. I think using a product management mindset is really important here. And you'll hear folks like Leaf talk a lot about partnering with PM. It's super important that we spend time on that, like really understanding what are the challenges that users are facing, and really thinking about that in our design. And so for me, it's like kind of looking at what is the sentiment across the org, having some of those conversations, and then building some small experiments and things to go tackle. It might be hard to convince the entire company to get on the paved road, but what if in phase one, you got a couple of high-risk teams or a couple of teams that you have really good partnerships with who can then kind of champion the value of that paved road? So you kind of grow the voice, I think, is really important. But definitely budget a fair bit of time for that alignment, especially if your organization is new to paved roads. If you're fortunate enough where paved road is part of your culture and it's just kind of how folks work, you might have a little bit more leverage, and the alignment piece might go a little bit faster. And one of the things I mentioned earlier, but I want to emphasize again, is just when you're partnering with teams, just emphasizing why this helps for long-term sustainability for engineering. I just generally find that when we start to have these conversations around planning and staffing, like kind of bucking this into that whole idea of like excellence and readiness, and like really building something that works great, has worked well for me in the past. So that's one of the tactics I'm currently using when I'm having these conversations at Netflix.
Nice. Yeah, that makes sense. And shout out also to Patrick Thomas, who gave a Locomocosec talk a year or two ago, also from Netflix, about like sort of product thinking in building paved road solutions, to sort of echo what you said as how important it is, for sure. Okay, here's sort of a two-part question. Well, so from James, how do you get credit for attacks that never get through? And then Casey, to add on to that, are there good metrics to measure your success? One thing I heard, this was from a woman on Google's red team. She said in a talk a while ago, like, for the red team op, the value is not just were we able to achieve our goal or not, or how many different ways were we able to compromise whatever, but also like how many new additional detections came out of the red team assessment that like the blue team then implemented, or how many kill chains in the future were killed or something like that. So that's like from a red team perspective, but for more like paved road, I'm curious about your thoughts.
Yeah. Again, I think another great question, Clint. We could probably spend an entire podcast talking about security metrics. Has been a passion area for mine. It's been kind of my life's work, honestly, has been around inventory and how to measure the effectiveness of a cybersecurity program. Actually has been my focus for many years. It's what I spent the majority of my time on at Netflix in the last few years. So I think a lot about this. And we're fortunate at Netflix to have an enterprise risk team and to have a couple of things that not every organization are going to have. And we pull all that into our metric story. But I want to ground it in some stuff that is more tractable, I think, for folks that don't have access to enterprise risk functions. I think in a certain degree, if you have some understanding of what your risks are, the first exercise I would suggest, and I think Magoo has some great resources of this on his Medium blogs, which we can reference later, is to kind of like understand like what are the risks you care about the most, and then for me it's what are the attacks to achieve those risks. Get a group of experts, a couple of coffees or some Mountain Dews, and sort of sit around and think like these are the types of attacks that we should care about, and what are the controls to mitigate those attacks? Where are they at? Where should they be based on our overall tolerance as an organization? And you might not know exactly what that tolerance is, but your public 10K might provide some insights, as well as you might be able to find some insights talking with leaders. And so once I kind of understand, okay, here are my risks, these are the attacks I think about, I set goals. I say, I want my control, I want my SSO to be across 90% of assets that are relevant to this risk. I want my web application firewall to be across 90%. And what I worked to then do is, once I set all those targets and I understand those control states for the particular risk, think about combining it into a single, depending on your audience, maybe a single metric, a single measurement. Maybe it's your posture. Or, we say our posture is effectively, it's a risk we care about and our control state to mitigate those risks. And some lagging indicators might be things like incidents and bug bounty costs, or they might be like red team stuff, like controls asserted, et cetera. It's a really tricky question. I definitely don't think I can answer it in like a minute, which is about how much time we have left. But I would say if you're starting, I think thinking about a clear articulation of the risks that matter to the business, a clear articulation of the ways that you think from an attack perspective they happen, and then mapping your controls against those attacks and seeing how well you're doing. And I think you're going to have to find the language that works with your organization. Coming in with like the MITRE heat map and being like, our controls are here, is probably not going to work. Might work for us. So we'll have to think about how do we translate that to a metric that works with leaders. And, I think one of the best ways to do that is just to define it as your posture and say our posture is simply we work to mitigate these risks, and this is how we do it and how well we're doing and benchmarking against that. So.
Yeah, well, thank you all so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. And thank you for all of the great discussion in the chat and all the awesome questions. There's so many things that we enjoyed talking about and that we still could talk about. So I guess look out for maybe, I don't know, a future discussion, a blog post or something like that, because I know there's a lot of things we would love to write about and share. And yeah, so keep the questions coming. Thanks for your time.